So these are topics that all of you brought up in the chat. So if I don't elaborate enough, or if you have any questions, go ahead and ask away. So someone wants to know more about roles of the president. Well, the president of the United States has two roles technically that political scientists divided up into: the head of government, which means they're the chief executive and administrator, and they're also the head of state, which means they're the figurehead. In other countries, that's two different people. So in Britain, for instance, the head of government is prime minister, and the head of state is the queen. In Germany, the head of government is the chancellor, which is like the prime minister, and the head of state is the president. In fact, in many parliamentary countries, they do have a president, and the president is just a figurehead. They go to the airport to meet and greet foreign dignitaries. They hold fancy lunches and cocktail parties for people and stuff like that, and they might be the person that starts the new government session or something like that. But other than that, they don't have a lot of power. And that would be in countries like Germany, for instance, which has a president that doesn't have any power, or Israel that has a president that doesn't really have any power, and so on. So if you're invited to meet with the president of France, that person actually appoints the prime minister and has, in that way, a lot of power. So if you're invited to have dinner with the president of France, you think, oh, that's spectacular. But if you're invited to meet with the president of Germany, you'd be like, ugh, I have something else to do, because they're not that important. And the president of the United States has both of these positions, which is unusual compared to other countries. And probably their most significant one out of the two, though, is head of government, because they are chief of the executive branch. And in that role, they do a lot of other things. They're basically the chief of the budget, because the data and the requests all come out of the executive branch. They're basically the chief economic policy maker, because even though Congress passes the budget and sets up all this money, it's then up to the president to distribute it correctly to all the different departments and how they spend it and what projects they take on, which can have a huge impact on the economy, since the government spends $2 to $3 trillion a year. And they are also basically the chief diplomat, because of head of state, they also hire ambassadors all around the world, and they attend many conferences and other types of events where they interact with other foreign dignitaries. And so they have a wide variety of impact on all these types of issues, and those are some of the different roles that they have. Informally, they're also the head of their party, and they can have a pretty big impact on that too, depending upon who they show favoritism toward in appointing the chair of the party. And then if they get involved with the state party chair elections, for instance, they can have actually a pretty strong control. And so two opposite perspectives I could give you on that would be Eisenhower, who didn't really even vote that much before he became president. Both parties pursued him to run, and he decided to be a Republican. And the only thing he really used the Republican National Committee for was to send out Christmas cards. And that was it. He didn't really care about the party. He didn't go out and help get other Republicans elected. He didn't fundraise or anything like that. Donald Trump is kind of the opposite. He has been involved in all the state chair elections, for instance, and many of them are allies of his. And he's gone around the country, for instance, and campaigned for people when he's at rallies. Usually there are congressmen, state representatives, other people like that there. So he's been very involved in the party in particular. So that can be good or bad. With Eisenhower, it was bad because he didn't really help pump up the party or get a lot of enthusiasm. But on the other hand, though, if things went badly for him, it didn't reflect on the party. So it's kind of a pro and con type of issue when it comes to that role for the president. And that's honestly one of the most significant parts, because we've seen if there's a split government and you don't have Congress on your side, then you're going to have a tough time getting things done. So a lot of people don't like that. They say, well, we elect a president, and for those 4 years, they should just be the chief executive like an administrator. But they really can't get that much done without Congress on their side. So they do need to be involved in that role as head of party. And somebody else asked, we can just segue here to the national budget. When the budget is created, the building across the street from the White House, the Executive Office Building, which before the Pentagon used to be the biggest office building in the world, there's over 1,000 people that work there, and one of the most important jobs that they have is preparing the budget. And what we use is the practice of incrementalism. Whenever you have a huge budget, even for companies, for instance, you don't start from scratch the next year. All that you do is you take the old budget, use it as a template, and then increase it through what we call incrementalism, which means well, you say, well, if prices are going up 1.5% this year, then maybe we should ask for a 1.5% increase in the budget, unless you're taking on some kind of new project or something like that. And each of the departments of the cabinet and all the independent agencies come up with their budgets based on the previous years, and they submit them to the Office of Management and Budget in this executive office building across the street from the White House. And they work on preparing the document, which is going to be over 10,000 pages altogether. And they put it together basically and include an abstract, a cheat sheet basically, and that is submitted to the chief of staff and then eventually the president of the United States so they can give their input. Well, maybe I wanted more to be spent on the EPA or less. And so they can throw in their 2 cents. And then it's sent to Congress. And this is where some of the gray area exists because the president's submitting this. So often it's referred to as the president's budget. But the budget is a law like anything else. So technically, it can only be proposed by members of Congress. And so that's how it will work. Usually, one of the party members that belongs to the same one as the president will submit it to the appropriate committee, appropriations and ways and means, and each of the parts of the budget that have to do with each department of the cabinet will then go to a separate committee. And so it's a long, long process that starts maybe with the State of the Union, where he mentions some of the items. And then in February, when it actually gets put on to the various committees in Congress, and then they have the whole way until October to approve it. And October the 1st is when the new budget year starts. So that way we avoid elections and getting involved with that. Now, sometimes, of course, they don't approve it in time. And then you have to lead to possibly a government shutdown where non-mandatory services are temporarily suspended because technically they don't have authorization to pay any of their bills. That happens occasionally. So that's how the national budget process works. Did that answer your question about that? Yeah. And then who was the presidential roles? What about you? Yeah. Okay. And then some of the other questions were about the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court justices, somebody asked about qualifications. Technically, there's none. There's none listed in the Article 3 of the Constitution. So if you just went by the Constitution, you could technically nominate a fern because it doesn't even say it has to be a human being. But obviously, of course, over time, we've had the expectation that they should have previous judicial experience. They should be judges. So that's an informal qualification, or at least an attorney. We have within the last century still nominated politicians. That has been something that's happened in the past. Dwight Eisenhower, for instance, nominated Earl Warren, the Republican governor of California, to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, even though he wasn't a judge at that time. He was just a governor. And so that has happened in the past, but it's unlikely because of all the scrutiny that happens at the Senate confirmation hearings that we would nominate anybody else but a judge. And even then, if they weren't, they would have to be an attorney at the least. And someone asked about terms. Why don't we have terms? Well, they wanted them to be completely removed from politics. So it was thought, the one political instance possibly was when they get nominated. And then after that, they would be free to exercise their judicial discretion without worrying about an election or whoever is running for office having influence on them. And that has worked in the past because there have been justices who had certain views, but then once they got on the court and saw the evidence brought before them, they maybe ruled differently than they viewed their own opinions in the past. So that's possible. Now, that causes controversy because sometimes there's the supporters from particularly their party feel betrayed, but it allows the justices to have a little bit more freedom. Now, of course, that causes a problem because, especially now, people can live and have the support, of course, of medical technology and pills and all kinds of other stuff that they can go into their 80s and 90s. And the question is do they still belong on the court after that? For instance, there are some liberals that are mad at Ruth Bader Ginsburg because she was already in her 80s. She had many different forms of cancer. And so they thought maybe, 2 or 3 years into Barack Obama's term, you should have retired. And so there are some people think that there should be some type of age limit. put on there. But then again, how do you determine that? Because obviously we have two presidential candidates. They're still in relatively good health in their 70s. And so some people an age is going to work, some people it's not. And obviously over time, that's just going to go up and up and up in the number of years that we have. And then the actual justices, let's see here. The justices themselves, what did you want to know about the justices?
Like the number of conservatives versus liberals.
Oh, yes. Well, and that's something Mitt Romney, the senator from Utah, who sometimes is a thorn in the side of the president, when he was asked about it, he said, yes, I will vote for the nominee because the country is conservative, so therefore the court should start having a conservative leaning. Well, it's actually had a conservative leaning since the 80s. It's had a Republican majority since then, and it's been 5-4, and now it will be 6-3, of course. And so it's actually had a conservative leaning for quite some time. In fact, the last, including the current one, two, three chief justices have been Republican. So it's had a conservative leaning, but some people are not satisfied sometimes when they rule the other way, or like I said, when a justice strays from the path a little bit. For instance, John Roberts, he votes with the other Republicans like 90% of the time, but because it's not 100%, there are some conservatives that are upset with him. So, how the Supreme Court works, and that's just, they take a very small number of cases. Cases can get through the federal system, working up, starting with the district court, which works like a regular courtroom, to the appeals court, and then to the Supreme Court. But they take a small number of cases. They do not take that many, maybe a couple hundred at the most, and that would be an extreme amount. Out of thousands, they get appealed to them. And they basically have teams of clerks. And if you're an attorney that graduated, especially from a prestigious program, especially from one of the Ivy League schools, you get hired to be one of these clerks that works with the justices, and you are the ones that read through these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases from each of these circuit court of appeals that the justice might be supervising. And you look for cases that you believe would be of national interest and also to an interest of the justice that you work for. And you select one of them and then take it to the justice and see if they agree. And they then try to convince 3 of their colleagues to take up the case. Otherwise, though, it can also get there from the state Supreme Courts. That's unusual. But if it involves a federal issue, for instance, the national elections, there have been a couple of cases that have gone from the state Supreme Courts up to the federal Supreme Court. So that would be an example of another way. Either of those ways are called appellate jurisdiction, but there are cases that can get there through original jurisdiction involving ambassadors or state disputes. And one thing, I don't know if I mentioned this already, but for instance, the state of New York has jurisdiction over Ellis Island, where the immigrants had come in, and they wanted to add on to the island. And so they hired a construction company to add on by adding rock and dirt and things like that so they could extend the museum facilities. But the problem is that New Jersey had jurisdiction over the water there. And so since that island expanded into the water, New Jersey said we should actually have control over this new part of Ellis Island. So that is an example of a case that involved 2 states that the Supreme Court took directly through original jurisdiction. So that's another way that the case can get there. And then once they have the cases, they have hearings with 30-minute sessions, and it involves a lot of debate behind the scenes. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know how it works because even the actual case, when they give those 30-minute presentations for each side involving a case, they do not allow video cameras. They don't allow photographs to be taken. People can come in from the public and view it through a ticket system. And they do allow reporters to do sketches of, I don't know why, because it's just 9 old people sitting with black robes on. It's going to be virtually the same thing every time, except when the justice changes. And they can just change the caption and the year, date, and everything on that if it's just the same justices. So other than that, it's incredibly secretive, and we don't know how they debate and what they do behind the scenes in particular. A little bit is known about their rituals. They do have the newest justices, like the newest woman that will be on there, Barrett. She will be the last one to go in speaking. She will be the last one to go and debate. She's the least likely one to write opinions. She even has to wait till all the other justices get up and go through the door. If they're in a closed session with none of their clerks, she has to go get the other one's coffee, for instance. So they do stuff like that, like a hazing of new justices. But other than that, little stories, we don't really know exactly what happens because they try to keep it to themselves. They don't want any one justice to get the heat for a ruling or get political pressure or things like that. So they keep a lot of it to themselves. And let's see, term limits. Why aren't there term limits for more positions? Well, the founding fathers wanted to, even though they didn't trust the people a lot and only the House of Representatives was elected directly, they thought that should be completely up to the people. So that their idea of a term limit was if your congressman was doing a bad idea, then you boot them out of office. Otherwise, they didn't have term limits even for the presidency. It was really only Washington's two-term tradition that was followed until FDR that made it seem like there was a term limit, but there really wasn't. And so that's why the founding fathers didn't think term limits were necessary. Plus, remember back then, except for some of the rich elite like Benjamin Franklin or a few of the others, most people didn't live into their 80s. They died in their 50s or 60s and 70s at the most. And so term limits really didn't have to necessarily be an option. It's only been within the last 30, 40 years through modern medicine that I've mentioned that we've had senators that were 100 and 101 and held the last year of their office from their hospital bed. So that's only been a recent situation. So that's another thing. Should we have age limits? Maybe that's more important than actual term limits, is limiting how long they can stay in there in relation to their age. And then the last one was, how do you track who's leading in the polls? We're asking about how they came up with those numbers. Oh, well, that's a good question. It's incredibly scientific. If you ever have a chance to take probability and statistics, they would go over the math behind it. But basically what they do is they randomly call, and that has become difficult with the advent of cell phones, but they randomly call a certain number of people. And for instance, if they want to do a national poll, they're probably going to call 3,000 to 6,000 people altogether. And you have to remember they have to call more than that because they're going to get a lot of people that hang up on them and swear at them and do other kinds of stuff. And so out of that 3,000 to 6,000 people, they might only need 1,500 responses. And the reason why they get more than that is because they have to whittle it down. They have to make sure half are men and half are women. 30% are African American, 50% are Latino. One of the mistakes they made in the 2016 election is they didn't break it down to education enough. So they corrected that because there was a big turnout for President Trump, especially from white men with a high school diploma and not a college degree. So they've corrected that and included education in the more recent polling that happens. So they need to make sure that they match all those numbers. The toughest part is determining turnout by saying that what percentage of Democrats are going to come out and vote and what percentage of Republicans are going to come out and vote. That's difficult to determine. And so they kind of have to try to do the best guess they can with the turnout numbers in determining what the polls will be. So that's how they do that. That's also why they offer a margin of error. They try to estimate what the possible range will be. So it could be +4, plus or minus 4. So for instance, if President Trump has a 50% approval rating, it could be as high as 54 or it could be as low as 46. So they give themselves kind of leeway, which is technically why in 2016 they weren't incorrect. In all three of those states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, even though it turned out that Trump won them instead of Hillary, they were still within the margin of error. So technically, according to probability and statistics, they were still correct in each of those cases. So that's how they come up with those numbers. Do people trust them? No, not all the time. And there's this notion that there's hidden people. Some people think there are hidden Trump voters that maybe live in more liberal areas, and so they're afraid, even if someone calls them on the phone, to say, no, I support President Trump. And then there's other people who say there's hidden Biden supporters. There's, especially because there's such a huge shift in women's views in particular, there's the consideration that for the first time, maybe a number of wives will separate from their husband's votes and go for Biden instead, but they don't want to say that. So who knows what could happen? We will see on Tuesday. And then once the voting is counted, which actually could take a week. Does anybody have any other questions or anything else that I did?